The laughter cut through the crowded street like a knife. An elderly vendor, hands trembling, bent down to pick up a trinket that had been cruelly knocked to the ground. The teenagers who mocked him grew bolder, their taunts echoing louder. No one in the crowd stepped forward, until a tall man in a hoodie did something that would leave everyone speechless. It was Travis Kelce, and his next move would change everything. The sun hung high over the bustling city, its glare bouncing off car windshields and storefront windows. The streets were alive with movement, honking horns, snippets of conversations, and the rhythmic slap of hurried footsteps against concrete. It was the kind of afternoon where most people moved quickly, heads down, focused on their destinations. But not everyone could afford to hurry. On a small corner of the busy street, an elderly vendor named Mr. Alvarez sat under a faded blue umbrella. His makeshift stall was a modest setup, a folding table covered with an old floral tablecloth. Spread across it were colorful trinkets, tiny wooden figurines carved with care, intricately beaded bracelets, and delicate keychains that sparkled faintly in the sun. Despite the vibrant display, people passed him by without a second glance. Mr. Alvarez, dressed in a worn-out button-up shirt and an apron that had seen better days, adjusted the items on his table, trying to make them look more appealing. He shifted the wooden figurines forward and straightened the bracelets into neat rows, his hands trembling slightly from age. Business had been slow for months, but today was particularly disheartening. The coins in his money tin barely jingled, and the clock seemed to mock him with every tick. Rent was due tomorrow. His stomach twisted as he thought about it. He couldn't afford to fail today. Not again. Across the street, a group of teenagers leaned casually against a graffiti-covered wall. Their laughter carried above the street noise, sharp and cutting. Mr. Alvarez noticed them glancing in his direction, their expressions twisted with amusement. One of the boys, tall with a backward cap, nudged his friend and pointed toward the vendor. "Look at that guy," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Sitting there all day for what? Nobody's buying that junk." The group chuckled, their laughter harsh and unkind. Another boy, wearing a baggy hoodie, added, "He's probably been here since sunrise. Bet he hasn't made enough to buy lunch." Mr. Alvarez's face tightened, but he kept his head down, pretending not to hear. His hands moved with deliberate care as he adjusted a row of bracelets, each bead reflecting the sunlight like tiny droplets of hope. The group wasn't finished. Emboldened by their own mockery, they crossed the street and strolled toward his stall. Their shadows loomed over his table as they closed in. The tall boy reached for one of the wooden figurines, a small, intricately carved owl. He turned it over in his hands with exaggerated curiosity. "How much for this?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery. $3, Mr. Alvarez replied softly, his voice barely audible over the bustling street. $3? For this piece of junk? The boy snorted and tossed the figurine back onto the table. It rolled off the edge, landing on the ground with a hollow thud. The group burst into laughter, their voices cutting through the air like knives. Mr. Alvarez bent down slowly, his knees protesting with every movement. He picked up the figurine, dusting it off with trembling hands before placing it carefully back on the table. "Please," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "Just leave me be." The teenagers exchanged smirks, their laughter growing louder. Another boy picked up a bracelet, holding it up as if inspecting it. $2 for this? Who even wears this stuff? He sneered. Before Mr. Alvarez could respond, the boy flicked the bracelet, sending it tumbling to the ground. Relax, old man, one of them said, leaning closer to the vendor. We're just messing around. A woman walking by glanced at the scene, her eyes darting nervously between the teenagers and the vendor. But she quickly looked away, tightening her grip on her shopping bags and hurrying off. No one stepped in. The tallest boy gave the vendor's wobbly stool a slight nudge with his foot. It wavered precariously, forcing Mr. Alvarez to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. The laughter grew louder, filling the street with its cruel echo. A tall man in a hoodie and baseball cap stood a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. His sharp eyes moved from the trembling vendor to the teenagers, then to the indifferent passers-by. It was Travis Kelce. He had just wrapped up a charity event nearby and decided to take a quiet walk through the city before heading back to his hotel. The commotion had caught his attention, and now he stood frozen, a mix of anger and disbelief to stand by and let things slide. He adjusted his cap and took a step forward, his imposing frame cutting through the crowd. "Hey," he said, his deep voice calm but firm. The laughter stopped abruptly. The teenagers turned, startled by the interruption. They didn't recognize him immediately, but something about his tone and presence made them uneasy. "What do you think you're doing?" Kelce asked, his voice even but edged with authority. The tallest boy shrugged, trying to play it cool. "We're just joking around, man. No big deal." Kelce stepped closer, his eyes locking onto the boy's. "It's a big deal to him," he said, nodding toward Mr. Alvarez. Ignoring the teenagers, Kelce crouched down beside the vendor and began picking up the fallen trinkets. His large hands handled each item with care, setting them neatly, he asked softly, glancing up at the vendor. Mr. Alvarez blinked, his eyes misty. I'm fine," he stammered, though his voice wavered. "Thank you." Kelce straightened and picked up a bracelet from the table. He held it up, examining the delicate beadwork. "How much for this?" he asked, his voice carrying over the street noise. $2, Mr. Alvarez replied hesitantly. Kelce reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. "I'll take it," he said with a small smile. The vendor's eyes widened. "But that's too much." Kelce shook his head. "Keep it. Your work deserves more than that." The energy in the crowd began to shift. People whispered among themselves, some recognizing Kelce now. "Isn't that Travis Kelce?" a man murmured to his wife. Word spread quickly, and more people stepped closer, curious about what was happening. Inspired by Kelce's actions, a man approached the table and picked up a wooden figurine. "I'll take this," he said, handing over a $5 bill. A young woman followed, selecting a bracelet. Soon, a small line began to form, and the once empty table was now surrounded by eager customers. Kelce stayed by Mr. Alvarez's side, chatting with him as people browsed. He asked about the trinkets, his genuine interest evident. Mr. Alvarez explained how he and his wife had started crafting together, how they had dreamed of opening a shop, and how he had continued after her passing. "She always believed these little things could make people smile," Mr. Alvarez said, his voice breaking. "I kept going for her, but it's been hard." Kelce listened intently, his admiration for the man growing with every word. Weeks later, Mr. Alvarez stood proudly at his new stall in the bustling artisan market. His table was beautifully arranged, each trinket displayed with care under a bright banner that read, as featured in Travis Kelce's charity auction. Customers came in droves, eager to support the man whose story had touched so many. Mr. Alvarez greeted each person with a warm smile, his heart full of gratitude. At the edge of the market, Kelce stood quietly, blending into the crowd. He watched as Mr. Alvarez handed a keychain to a young boy, his face lighting up with pride. For a moment, their eyes met. Mr. Alvarez gave a small nod of thanks, and Kelce returned the gesture. No words were needed. The moment spoke volumes. As Kelce turned to leave, a small group of kids ran past him, laughing. He smiled, pulling his hoodie lower over his face. This wasn't about him. It was about the ripple effect of kindness and the hope it brought to others. As the last items on the table were sold, Kelce turned to the crowd. "This man's work is incredible," he said, his voice strong and steady. "We should all support people like him, people who work hard and put their heart into what they do." The teenagers, who had been watching from a distance, shuffled awkwardly. Their earlier bravado was gone, replaced by quiet embarrassment. One of them muttered an apology before slipping away into the crowd. Kelce picked up a wooden figurine and turned back to Mr. Alvarez. "I know some people who'd love your work," he said. "How about we feature these at a charity auction? We can get them in front of more people who'll appreciate them." Mr. Alvarez's hands trembled as he wiped his eyes. You'd do that for me?" Kelce grinned. "Absolutely. Let's make it happen." By the end of the day, Mr. Alvarez's table was nearly empty. He had sold almost everything, and the few remaining items were set aside for Kelce's auction. News of the incident spread quickly. A bystander who had filmed the entire event posted the video online, and it went viral within hours. People were moved by Kelce's kindness and the vendor's resilience. Comments poured in, praising Kelce for standing up and showing compassion. Donations began to pour in for Mr. Alvarez. Local businesses reached out, offering to stock his trinkets, and a nearby artisan market invited him to set up a permanent stall. His story resonated with so many, sparking conversations about kindness and standing up for others.